Hello and welcome to another Thursday here on Viking.TV. In a week where we've been celebrating Paris and the River Seine and everything that goes down it. Everyone in France, of course, remembers where they were on April the 15th, 2019, because on that day, Paris nearly lost its soul. It was the day that we were all stunned, shocked, and then heartbroken to see Notre Dame go up in flames. And there seemed to be little that could be done to stop the massive fire from engulfing it and wiping out potentially 900 years of beauty, history, and human heritage. It burned for something like 15 hours, and we all thought everything was lost when finally and dreadfully the iconic medieval spire collapsed, and it sort of collapsed in on itself onto the cathedral and changed the skyline of Paris. That spire had been there since 1220, I think, so after a fire rebuilt in 1859, but to lose it seemed absolutely disastrous at the time. But France rose in defiance, and President Macron vowed that Notre Dame could and would be rebuilt in record time. In fact, in just 4 years, he said. It seemed crazily ambitious at the time, but within hours, pledges and donations worth millions of euros were pouring in from all over the world, and suddenly it seemed as though the impossible might indeed be possible. Well, my guest today was in Paris that very evening and remembers only too well the sad sight of Notre Dame engulfed by fire. Little did he know that day that he would be witness to its rebirth. So he can tell us all about the amazing work that is being done right now on site to restore one of the world's most famous landmarks, and of course, historic place of pilgrimage and worship since the Middle Ages. So I think we can see now the cover of the February edition of National Geographic. That's how I read about it all here in Britain. And I have to tell you, this man writes just like you would expect from such a man in such a top job. So please meet the Executive Environment Editor at National Geographic, the author of this special report covering the enormous restoration project going on in the heart of Paris right now. Hello and welcome to Robert Kunzig, who joins us now from Washington, DC. It's lovely to meet you. Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Anne. It's nice to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to talk to you, because I think all over the world we've been so curious about what's been going on. And you were there that very evening that fire broke out, and we were all watching from our homes and thinking, oh my God, what were you thinking? Where were you? What were you doing?
Yeah, I lived in France for many years, and I try to get back there as often as I can. And on that evening, my wife and I had arrived the day before in Paris for a week's vacation with some friends who had never been there before. And we were that evening at just before 7 o'clock, we were in a taxi cab crossing the Ile de la Cité, the island that Notre Dame sits on our way from the left bank to the right bank to go to dinner. And my wife looked out the back window of the cab and said, "Is Notre Dame on fire?" And I couldn't believe it at first. The traffic had stopped by then, and you looked out and you could just see a little patch of orange on the roof, and it seemed unreal, frankly. But then, and I thought, you know, it was one of those things that you think just can't be happening, and that it'll stop happening quickly. And I said something like, "Oh, I'm sure they're going to put it out, whatever it is." But as we were stopped in traffic long enough that we saw the flames shoot up the spire, the wooden spire, and engulf it, and before we even managed to cross the island and head on to dinner. We continued on and spent the evening at the restaurant, and then decided to walk back so that we could have a look at what was going on. And we found crowds lining the banks of the Seine on the right bank where we were coming from, and we just pushed our way through the crowds and crossed, you could see from all around, because Notre Dame is a central monument in Paris. You could see the glow in the sky. As you got closer, you could see the flames on the roof, and the spire had fallen by then. But we crossed the Ile Saint-Louis and stepped over a fire hose that the firemen were just then laying to pump water from the Seine, because they brought in 2 boats to get enough water. They were really not quite prepared for this disaster, as it turned out. And we stopped on the Pont de la Tournelle towards the left bank, and there was a crowd of people. A sort of impromptu choir had formed, and people were softly singing a hymn to the Virgin Mary, and some people were kneeling, and people were praying, and lots of people were filming it with their cell phones, of course. And it was a shocking and unforgettable evening. And I think what's remarkable is how it stirred people just all over the world.
It really did. And I know we all know that nobody died, but a lot of people thought it was a bit of a 9/11 moment, wasn't it? Because it was something that mattered so hugely. I mean, I live in Britain, and I went on my family WhatsApp and immediately said, "Oh my God, have you seen Notre Dame is burning?" It was important, wasn't it?
It was hugely important. And it was, the comparison to 9/11 was made at the time by the French themselves. I mean, in the initial hours, some people thought, there were rumors it was a terrorist attack. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. It was clearly an accidental fire that's been established. But as you say, no one died, thank goodness. Not even, I don't believe even any terrible injuries to the firemen who ended up saving the church. But there was a huge blow to the psyche of the country. I think it's not just to the French, to so many people have memories associated with this place, and it's a reminder of things we take for granted. I think these sort of fixtures in our lives that we assume are there forever, and even and especially as change seems to come faster and faster in our lives, I think we unknowingly cling to these little islands of stability and these emotional anchors that these buildings represent. And the Notre Dame was just an absolutely central one to the French. I mean, as you said, it had been there for 900 years.
Yeah, 900 years, exactly. 900 years is a long time. And it's not just the building, it's the people who have built it. It's the people who made the wonderful things that were inside it. It's the investment of those human people in 900 years of history. And that was the worry about whether the flames would just completely eradicate it. But luckily, not so.
No, they didn't. They did tremendous damage, but the damage was confined. Essentially, the fire consumed the roof of the church, and the wooden, the medieval oak beams that supported the roof, and the spire, which like the roof was made of a wood framework coated in lead. And that's essentially it. Yeah. So there can be some hope that it will be rebuilt readily enough.
But you didn't know, as you were watching it burn, and you didn't know that you were going to become so intrinsically involved in watching its rebirth, but you have done. Tell us about how did you get involved? Obviously, you're National Geographic. I mean, how did you get involved in the idea of trying to get into its rebirth?
Well, I was in the right place in the right time, at National Geographic when the people on our history and culture desk did cover the event. They wrote news stories about it, but they immediately saw that this was something that was going to merit a deeper and longer term look of the kind of story we do in the magazine, where we invest very heavily in photography over the long term and deep reporting. And they were looking for a writer. They signed up a photographer very quickly. That's my friend Tomas Van Houtryve, who's based in Paris. and then they were looking for a writer, and I'm known as a Francophile here on the staff, and that you know, as I say, I lived there a long time. I love the country. I became a French citizen, in fact, and so and I speak French, and I also have an interest, even though I'm the environment editor, I have a long-standing interest in history, and my colleagues knew that, and so they asked me to take it on, and I was only too happy to oblige.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got some shots here of Notre Dame as it looked before the fire. Obviously, what everybody goes to. If anyone goes to Paris, they probably want to see Notre Dame. There you go. As it was, that's what you go and see, even if you don't go inside and even if you don't really study it. And then, of course, we are all familiar now with the terrible shots of how it burned. Oh, God. I mean, just thinking that, I remember the feelings at the time. And then this wonderful shot that Tomas Van Houtryve, you just said, oh, sorry, that's of it's burning still. And then the next one, I think, is this amazing photograph that he took just a few weeks ago, I think, showing that it's glittering and it's beautiful, it's still there, and it has promise, doesn't it?
Yes. Glittering and beautiful, but shrouded in scaffolding for the moment, and with a giant crane towering over it. It remains a gorgeous building, but it's very much a wounded building. That shot you showed before, I really have to say, is about one of my favorite views in the world, and I know I'm not alone. It's an iconic view, that view of the apse of Notre Dame from upstream a little bit on the left bank, the Quai de Montebello, it's still there, but in another few years, maybe we'll see it like that once again.
When you lived there, did you go there? Did you go to mass there, or was it something you just took for?
No, I didn't actually live. I've never actually lived in Paris. I lived in Dijon, France, and I've lived in Europe a lot of my life, off and on since childhood. And so I don't even remember when I first went to Notre Dame, but it would have been as a boy, which is quite a long time ago now. And so when I lived in Dijon, I went to Paris regularly for work, and I would make a point to walk by Notre Dame just because it's really one of my favorite places in the world. And so I would go in it, and in later years, less and less would I go in it because it got harder and harder to get into it. When I was a boy, you just walked into Notre Dame, and yes, I did go to mass there. I was brought up Catholic, actually, but in later years, as it became so popular for good reason, it became harder and harder just to stroll into Notre Dame. So I realized when I started to do this story that I couldn't quite remember the last time I had been inside. I mean, I remember one very memorable time I was inside. It was when I was hoping to do an article on Gothic cathedrals back in the late 90s, and I convinced a scholar from Columbia and the university in the U.S. to take me on a sort of behind the scenes tour of Notre Dame, and we climbed up the North Tower as the tourists do, and onto the platform between the towers, and then we had a guardian with us who opened the door into the attic and led us into the attic above the nave. And walked along that on this little walkway that used to be there. That was you would walk along the tops of the vaults that you never saw. It's the backstage scene of the nave of Notre Dame, and instead of looking up at these soaring, gorgeous, heavenly vaults, you're looking at the dusty elephant backs of the tops of the vaults with really deep pools of dust in the crevices between them, and very dim light, almost no light. In fact, it was just sort of daylight filtering in through these small rose windows that are in the gables were in the gables of the church. And we walked down to the crossing of where the nave meets the transept and the choir, and we looked up into the sort of wooden skeleton of the the spire, and then climbed out onto the roof of the side aisle and walked around. Anyway, it was quite a memorable moment, and all of that is what is now burned. Actually, that what they called the forest, which are these in the nave and the choir, were the original medieval beams hewed by hand in the 13th and 12th centuries by medieval carpenters, and that it was those giant beams that gave a really unique atmosphere to the place. You could feel the history, you could feel the craftsmanship, you could feel the people who made it. It was a very different feeling from being inside the church itself, which is fabulous, of course. But but it was wood, and that's what burned on April 15th, 2019.
But pretty soon we'll tell the story of the wood, because that's amazing in itself. But as we look at the building itself and its spot in Paris, as you say, it's on an island in the river. For those people who haven't yet been to Paris and seen it, and they will soon, they'll be able to see it. It's always something that even if you don't go inside, you want to say you've seen it. It's an incredible place. And it does look remarkable. You see the whole of Paris from it. No wonder Victor Hugo wrote, the Hunchback of Notre Dame dangling from some of the ramparts in the building, because you see the whole of Paris underneath it, don't you?
You do, and it is really the center of Paris. You could say it is not the geographic center, but it's the cultural, spiritual center of France. And it is geographically the point on the map from which the French measure all distances from Paris. It's kilomètre zéro, the 0 kilometer mark on French maps. There's a little plaque in the pavement on the square in front of Notre Dame. But in the 12th century, it would have been the center of a small but rapidly growing town, maybe 150,000 people. Paris was on its way to becoming the biggest city in Europe then, and the French nation was just then being established, and there was this sort of rivalry between the church and state at the time. And the Notre Dame was created by an ambitious bishop named Maurice de Sully, who was trying to show his power, and he drew on this radical new style of architecture that had really just been invented, one could say, at Saint-Denis outside Paris a few decades earlier, and built really the first truly fully Gothic masterpiece as a way of showing his power.
Oh yeah, absolutely a masterpiece.
And his devotion to Christ, of course.
It's Notre Dame de Paris. Yeah, it's Notre Dame de Paris, which it's Our Lady of Paris. Yes. And you write in the article you wrote, you wrote that when the spire fell into it, it was like the jagged wound torn in Notre Dame's heart. And that's what it felt like when you watched it go. It was awful. And
that moment that your picture captures right here is what I saw from a different angle in that taxi cab, and it's when it all became real. When you saw the flames lick up the spire, you knew this was not something that was going to be put out any soon, and that the spire was clearly not savable, and that therefore this sort of central landmark of the Paris skyline was temporarily at least doomed.
Yeah. I was just going to say changed forever. It won't be, because we will talk about how they're going to rebuild it in some way. We have some amazing drone video footage from Nat Geo. Thank you very much. Which I tell you what, it gives us a chance to actually look at a building that we would never have seen. Some things that you can now see by drone. These are amazing statues that you'd only have to look up at, but now we can see straight on. At the moment, we're looking down, of course, on the tragedy, on what happened, and hole in the middle of Notre Dame. But
Yeah.
as we go down, you can see more and more features that I don't know whether we'd have ever seen before.
No, you wouldn't have ever seen stuff from this angle. Not likely. It's not easy to be allowed to fly a drone in that place. There's quite a lot of permitting required. My colleague Tomas Van Houtryve took care of all that. He was on this project for more than a year, and quite a lot of it was negotiating the permits and the jumping through the hoops of the French bureaucracy to be allowed into the church basically at will, and to be allowed to fly his drone outside and around the church and then inside the church. Maybe you'll show some of that footage later. He's quite a remarkable photographer, and he used for this story, he used everything from drones, which is, a technology of the last decade or two that has become de rigueur for National Geographic photographers doing landscape stuff. But he also went back and took portraits of some of the people restoring Notre Dame with a 19th century camera that he bought in a Paris antique shop. And so he made his portraits of these people who are restoring the church as it was in the 19th century with a camera that had been made at literally the same, and using a technology, what collodion on glass plates, that was the photographic technology of the time of the last restoration.
Okay, so some really ordinary questions then, because you've been in there. Does it still smell of fire?
No, I wouldn't say it does. It smells, it smells like an old church.
Oh, they've done a good job then cleaning it up.
They've removed the burnt debris. I mean, we are now approaching 3 years after the fire. And so some people are quite surprised to learn that, they're only just starting the rebuilding itself now. All this time, the first 2 years, they were literally removing debris and starting to clean the church and securing the church, because right after that fire, it was in some danger of suffering further damage. It was not very stable. And so there was a lot of rescue to be done of the church before they could even contemplate the restoration. And of course, the restoration is something that has to be very carefully planned by a team of architects, and they're letting out contracts to various specialists and so they're just getting started on it now. But initially, perhaps I'm sure it did smell while all that charred debris, the beams from those rafters that I mentioned, that some of them fell through the holes in the vaults that the fire had caused and fell onto the floor of the church. And there were right after the fire, there would have been great piles of charred stone and wood on the floor of the church. And I'm sure it did smell quite a lot of fire then. But all of that has been removed now, and it had been removed by the time I got back in there last summer.
And what about the lead? Lead has been a big problem.
Lead the entire roof was made of lead. Lead is a standard roofing material. I know it's not just in France, in Britain, on many British churches as well. It's considered a roofing material of choice. It's very flexible. It's very impermeable. It's easy to work with. But there were some 450 tons of it, I think, on Notre Dame, and the fire melted it. It melted it completely. So most of the lead just sort of trickled or poured down onto the stones and the wood and fell onto the floor of the cathedral. And some of it, perhaps a ton of it, the fire got so hot that particles of lead sort of were lofted into the smoke and blew out over Paris, and later settled on Paris. And this for a time became, well, I say for a time, it is still a controversial thing in Paris. There was tremendous concern, especially on the part of parents, that their kids had been exposed. In the church itself, it was a huge problem. Initially, they were in the church almost immediately trying to remove some of the debris, but after a couple months, the safety and the workplace inspectors in France got wind of how the work was going on there and decided that not nearly enough safety precautions had been taken against lead. And so they imposed fairly strict ones that slowed down the work quite a lot. Anyway, I don't know how I can tell you about that if it's of interest, but lead is a problem, has been a problem both for the workers. They have to go to considerable trouble to protect themselves from it, and it was a concern for Parisians, because some lead from the fire did settle out on Paris.
Oh, the other thing is that you found that is the way Notre Dame was built. It was because it was obviously about, it was an incredible image for God, but it had very, very tall walls, very tall walls, which of course, because of the fire, were then made very vulnerable because of the fire. You wrote that without the lead roof and timbers weighing in on them and tying them together, the walls were frighteningly vulnerable to wind. That was a big problem too, immediately.
Yes, they were very concerned about that. There was an analysis done by a researcher at the University of Versailles who calculated that because there were now these very tall walls that were just standing free there, and they had the famous flying buttresses pushing on them from the outside, but the forces of those buttresses were no longer countered by the weight of the roof and of all those oak beams. There was no countervailing forces, and so if a significant wind were to hit one of the walls, there was fear that it could topple. And so they, and then there was another risk, and that was that the cathedral had been under restoration at the time of the fire. A long-term restoration had begun, and the spire was surrounded by scaffolding. And that scaffolding was badly damaged by the fire. It became kind of a crumpled, sagging mass. And so there was a fear that it could fall and take down some of the walls too. So that was some of what they were doing during those 2 years that I mentioned. They were removing that scaffolding like a how do we say it? In French, they say mikado, and the pickup sticks, like a giant game of pickup sticks. There are all these interlocking sticks, and rope technicians dangling from ropes cut off individual poles of this scaffolding one by one and carried them away. And then they slowly stabilized all the flying buttresses. They built custom-made oak trusses, would you call them? Yeah, or buttresses, under the flying buttresses. And then slowly under each, one by one, they buttressed each of the arches, each of the vaults in the inside the cathedral, so that they would not collapse. And so now it took about 2 years for them to declare the cathedral fully secure.
But isn't it incredible that I think you must feel this as well, that the people, the experts who are there doing their other experty jobs, and suddenly when something like that happens, they are drawn in. And that's what I love about the way you tell the story. You draw in all of those people who didn't know what they were doing that night. They were feeding their kids, their usual, they were microwaving a meal for the children, or they were doing something, and suddenly, but because they are experts in a particular field, they get drawn in. Do you mind me reminding you of some of the characters that you told the stories?
Not at all, not at all.
For a start, there's Viollet-le-Duc, who was. Go on, you tell the story.
Viollet-le-Duc was the 19th century architect who was a pioneer of the very art of historic restoration. Historic restoration, I mean, the current architect of Notre Dame, Philippe Villeneuve, says Viollet-le-Duc invented historic restoration. That's perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but before the 19th century, there really was no systematic effort on the part of a government to restore historic monuments. That was really invented in France in the 19th century, and no doubt more or less simultaneously in places like England. But the French were particularly systematic at it, and Viollet-le-Duc was one of the very first architects of this new system, and Notre Dame one of the very first projects. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Abbey Church of the Madeleine of Vézelay in Burgundy. That's another UNESCO World Heritage Site, a Romanesque monument that Viollet-le-Duc had started restoring even before Notre Dame. But Notre Dame was one of his first and biggest triumphs, and he massively restored the church, made all sorts of changes to it that people don't necessarily know about today. Some of the things we think of as quintessentially Gothic, like all that you showed a picture earlier of one of those little monsters at the top of the west facade, the chimère, the chimera they're called, or grotesques. Viollet-le-Duc added all those. They weren't part of the medieval.
He was like 1830. Yeah.
The restoration. He was born in 1814, and he was about age 30 when he started the restoration in 1844, and it lasted about 20 years. So the grotesques he probably added towards the end of that, I think. But so he was
1830. He was very important in the whole history of Notre Dame.
He was absolutely central, and the church that they are restoring now was really Viollet-le-Duc's. What they're restoring is Viollet-le-Duc's restoration of the medieval church.
Isn't that interesting? Because now you come right bang up to what happened with the fire, and Villeneuve, Philippe Villeneuve, who at age 17 was a student of Viollet-le-Duc. He was
yes,
but he found himself. He has now found himself in the center of rebuilding what we're trying to achieve at the moment.
Right. Philippe Villeneuve is one of 35 people in France that occupy a distinctively French profession, which is architecte en chef des monuments historiques, chief architect of historic monuments. And these are, you think there's a chief, there can only be one, but no, they're 35, and they're each responsible for a region of France. And they are they're freelancers, actually. They're not civil servants. They have great independence, but they work on contract for the government to restore these designated historic monuments. And Villeneuve is responsible for Notre Dame and has been since about 2013, even before the fire. So he was the one who was directing the restoration before this fire happened. And he was brought into this profession, he says, by Viollet-le-Duc, by the experience at age 17, when he already had a passion for architecture. In fact, he was in the process of building a model of Notre Dame, but he didn't know you could make a living that way. He didn't know that there were people who devote their lives, architects who devote their lives to historic restoration. But thanks to Viollet-le-Duc, there in a way there are, and thanks to the exhibition about Viollet-le-Duc that happened at the Grand Palais in around 1980, I guess. Philippe Villeneuve became acquainted with this possibility, and he never looked back. And he is a passionate devotee of Viollet-le-Duc and passionately committed to restoring the great man's work, which includes the spire. The spire that burned was not the medieval spire. It was because that had been dismantled during the French Revolution in the 1790s. The spire that burned was one that was a somewhat more ambitious and grander spire that Viollet-le-Duc designed and built in the 1850s.
Oh my God, you see, the history is amazing, isn't it? And then, see, I love the way you tell the story, because Marielle Didier, who was the culture minister conservator responsible for Notre Dame, she apparently, But the minute she heard that there was a fire going on, she knew she had to rush there and save some of the treasures.
Yes, a couple of the characters I met, there was a party going on at Versailles the night of the fire. They had just finished the restoration of the Queen's apartments at Versailles, Marie Antoinette's apartments. That restoration had been directed by none other than Marielle Didier's husband. She was at the party. She got a phone call saying, have you heard? And no, she had not. She immediately jumped in her car and rushed back, got stuck in traffic, of course, wasn't there to see the spire fall, got there later. She is responsible. This is a government official, senior government official, who is responsible for all the treasures inside Notre Dame, for their care and tending and restoration, and for signing off on any plan to restore the building itself that an architect like Philippe Villeneuve will submit. So she arrived at the building. There was a perimeter set up by the firefighters. The culture minister was there, I think, and her immediate boss, and they managed to talk their way through it and to get into the back area where these containers that are sort of temporary offices had been set up by Villeneuve for his crew for the restoration. And they found what the scene they found there, she told me, was like a giant flea market, because the firefighters had already been trying to save as much as they could. So they'd been walking into the church and just grabbing whatever they could. And she said, well, actually, they were grabbing lots of stuff that wasn't so important, candelabras here and there off the, but they had also grabbed some of the more important treasures. She herself went into the sacristy with a couple of them to get a few more items. But then the mayor of Paris made available a vault at the Hôtel de Ville, the town hall, which is just across the river on the right bank. And they set up a convoy of vans to carry the treasures that night to this vault for safekeeping. And the treasures of Notre Dame are considerable. The biggest would be the crown of thorns, that is said to be the crown that Jesus wore when he was crucified, that the Romans put on his head. That is in a sort of crystal annulus designed by Viollet-le-Duc, was held in the church, and they carried that in the backseat of this van. Marie-Hélène herself had the tunic of St. Louis, who was the crusader who had purchased the crown of thorns and brought it back to France. And his tunic, the tunic of a peasant that he wore because he was, he was a good king. He became a saint after all. That's preserved as a relic at Notre Dame. She had that on her lap as they drove across the river. So yes, it was quite a night, and quite a shocking night for. Oh,
I'm shocking. I'm brilliant now to hear those stories, and that you tell them so well in your article. Of course, President Macron, that very night, he was having trouble domestically with the Yellow Jackets, lots of domestic protests going on. But he had just recorded a speech to be put out over the nation. But he then realized, when the minute he saw what was happening, he cancelled that speech going out, and he rushed to the cathedral. And he made a big speech about Notre Dame is our history, our literature, our imagination. It's the epicenter of our life. And he made this vow that we will rebuild, and we will rebuild quickly. I don't know how people thought of it. It was very ambitious, wasn't it?
It was very ambitious, and I think some specialists in the business of historic restoration considered it overly ambitious and a little ridiculous, maybe even grandstanding. But I don't know. I think there is a time for a leader to set ambitious goals, and I was actually somewhat persuaded by the way the general who Macron has now placed in charge of this restoration put it, who said it was absolutely, people were intensely depressed on the night of that fire, and the television coverage of it included lots of people saying that, that this would never be, it could never be restored. France was not capable of restoring Notre Dame as it was, that this was lost forever. And so I do think that Macron's appearance was justified as a way of sort of rallying the nation. Whether they will make it in 5 years, I don't know. I think it's doable, but I think it was a good thing that he spoke out and that he committed the country. And it helped immediately rally support from around the world, because the donations flooded.
They poured in, didn't they?
Yes.
I mean, millions and millions of euros poured in.
Millions, yes, 840 million as the last count I heard, and a lot of it that very first night. Some of it was, of course, giant donations from French billionaires, but it poured in from around the world, including the 30 million euros from the United States.
Of course, if anyone's visiting Paris now, it's different. If you want to go to Notre Dame, it's not like it would have looked. The scene in Paris right now is very much changed. We've got some lovely drone footage, courtesy of your lovely people at Nat Geo, to see how it looks now. And it is extraordinary being able to see Notre Dame close up and all of the incredible features that we can see close up from the drone cameras. But also, when you look down, you see this sort of tented city underneath it. And that's why, obviously, presumably, if you try and get close, you can't, because so many streets are closed off. But there, we're looking now at what it looks like.
Yeah, I can explain the tents if you like. And those are, I don't believe those are no longer there now. I believe that must have been from the first couple of years. And what that was I mentioned that there was this long, elaborate operation to remove all the debris from the floor of the church. And they did it, and this was led by archaeologists, and it was coordinated by an archaeologist I met named Dorothée Chaouy-Derieux, who's another culture ministry official. And they did it with robots because they didn't want to venture out into the center of the nave because they were afraid the walls or more of the vaulting could collapse on them. So they had teleguided robots to get all these beams and stones out of the center and then sort them. And because this is such a monument, everything, all of that burnt debris, I would call it, but Dorothée would call it vestiges. They were historic artifacts. They were legally protected. They weren't just carted off and chucked into a skip somewhere. They had to be sorted by trained professionals. And they did that first on the side aisle of the church, but then in those tents, they call them barnums. They're like circus tents out in front of the church. And they sorted all the debris down to the smallest bits and pulled out any stones that they thought might be salvageable and reusable. And they pulled out any pieces of wood that they thought might have any historical archaeological information about the construction of the church. And they sent it all eventually to warehouses. There's the bigger bits are all stacked on shelves, 10 feet high in a vast warehouse near Charles de Gaulle Airport. And the smaller, the dust is in giant bags. And they haven't thrown anything out, at least as of late last year. Everything has been saved for the moment. Even the dust and ash is in bags in a warehouse. And so those tents were used for a couple of years to sort the material. But they're not there any longer, I don't believe.
But all of that is very interesting to the historians, because I gather there was an enormous debate in Paris about how they should restore it. Should they restore it in a modern way, or incorporate something that said 21st century, or should they restore it in a medieval way?
Yes.
I mean, it was extraordinary. It even came down to the carpenters.
Even came down to what? Sorry, no.
The carpenters.
Yes, there was quite a debate. It was set off by Macron himself because, it is an interesting question. When one of these buildings is destroyed, should we rebuild it? Some would say slavishly, just as it was, or should we be proud of our 21st century capabilities and put our own mark on it? Let a modern architect have a go at Notre Dame and do something distinctive in 21st century. Well, initially, Macron encouraged the latter idea. He said we should have his prime minister said we're going to organize an international competition, and they encouraged ideas be submitted. And some of the ideas that were submitted were so zany, I guess one might say. Why don't we, replacing the spire with a glass spire was probably one of the more conservative of them. I mean, another idea was to put a greenhouse in place of the roof. And a third idea was to do away with the roof altogether and convert the top of Notre Dame into an open air swimming pool that you would reach via elevator or something. It's hard to know how serious the creators who suggested these things were, but they were out there and they got a lot of publicity, and they scared the dickens out of anyone in France committed to historic restoration, like Philippe Villeneuve. And he was having none of it. He was committed from the start. These are people, whose heart has been ripped out. They're saying, oh, well, maybe you want a bionic. No, they want this thing of this locus of emotional attachment restored as it was. As I think, and the way I thought about it, I mean, initially when I started reporting, I thought, why do we have to build everything exactly as it was? But the more I spent time in this, looking at this place that I've known for so long and loved for so long, and the more I talked to people who are professionally engaged with it, I came to think like that the way Marielle Didier explained it to me, this was not, she had, not the slightest doubt that the church needed to be restored just as it was. She said it was an accident. It wasn't an event, some cigarette or electrical short circuit, we still don't know what, destroyed the roof and spire of Notre Dame. There's no meaning to that, really. It was an accident. We don't have to mark the significance of this by putting some new thing on it that will cause people to remember the accident for all time. We should fix it and move on. That was her attitude. And it's happened many times before at other cathedrals we know and love today. Some of your listeners will no doubt have been to Chartres, one of the other most famous cathedrals. Well, there was a terrible fire at Chartres in the 1830s, so it has a copper roof now that it didn't exist before, and it was it was a disaster very similar to what hit Notre Dame, and it has happened to other cathedrals in France, and they've been restored more or less as they were. And people, unless you're someone who is interested in this history, you don't even know when you go there that the accident ever happened.
It's interesting as well, though, that wasn't there a group of people called Carpenters Without Borders, who actually showed them that actually, we can source the right wood and we can do it in the right way that is completely respectful of its history.
Yes, that's carrying the idea. So rebuilding it so that it looks the same, to the outside and untrained eye is one thing, but the Carpenters Without Borders, which is a group founded by a remarkable man named François Calame of Rouen. He's both a carpenter and an ethnologist himself, and he is deeply committed to the idea of maintaining traditions of craft, including of carpentry. And he personally has done a lot to revive in France the art of medieval carpentry, which had pretty much vanished during the 20th century. He went to Romania to find people who were still hewing beams with hand axes, and he got them to teach French people to do it. And so now there is a small sort of coterie of craftsmen in France who are capable of making beams the medieval way, which is to cut down an oak tree that is not much bigger than the beam you need, maybe a foot across in the case of Notre Dame, and then to square it off with a broad axe. And that picture you showed a minute ago was the Carpenters Without Borders they built one of the trusses, the 24 trusses that held up the roof of Notre Dame. They built it in about a week using only medieval techniques, only medieval hand tools, to show that Notre Dame could be restored, that the arc of the roof, the framework of Notre Dame could be restored in the same way. Now, I don't think they're going to do it exactly that way, but they are going to use some of those they're going to finish it off, Villeneuve assured me. They're going to do some of the trimming of the wood at sawmills to save time, because they are in quite a rush. But they are going to finish them off with hand axes, so that if you have an occasion to visit the forest someday in the future, as I did in 1998, it should look similar, even though, the one I saw was 800 and some years old, and this one will be new, but it'll have been made in the old way. And the Carpenters Without Borders believe that is part of the way that you restore the emotional impact of a place.
Yes, you will have to go and just make sure you have the right to carve your initials there for somebody in 800 years' time to have a look. I mean, there are such amazing characters to this whole story, and that's what I found so amazing when I read your article. But this guy that President Macron put in charge, he's a general, isn't he? He's an army general, Jean-Louis Georgelin.
Jean-Louis Georgelin. He's a retired general, and not just any general. He was the top military official of France. He was the Général des Armées. And in America, we would say the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yes. Yeah. And I gather he is that sort of figure. He is a 5-star
general. Yes.
Yeah. And he's getting it done by the sound of it. Although I gather on the night of the fire, he cried.
He did. He said he did. He was at home. Jean-Louis Georgelin is unlike most people in France these days, unlike most of the people I interviewed for the article, is himself a devout Catholic. He was raised in conservative Catholic schools. He knows his Latin. He knows his Psalms in Latin. He goes to Mass regularly, and he used to go to Mass at Notre Dame. He lives in Paris. And so I'm sure he did, hard-bitten military man that he is, I'm sure he did feel the emotion of that night very powerfully, again, with no idea that it was going to involve him until he got a call the next day at noon from Macron at the Élysée, summoning him to a meeting that evening. And Macron immediately, Macron was determined to get this done quickly, and he was deeply skeptical of the ability of his own bureaucracy to do it quickly. And so he decided he needed someone who both had a familiarity with the bureaucracy, because you can't be chairman of the Joint Chiefs in France without knowing your way around the government, and yet had this sort of charisma and authority to move things along and maybe to, break a few eggs on the way. And so that he made Georgelin his point man, and then Georgelin was later that year put in charge of this corporation, they've created a separate entity, sort of outside the usual hierarchy of the culture ministry, to try to give it independent authority to move things along faster.
Yeah, that usually works, doesn't it? It's interesting you're working with, I don't know whether when you go on a story like this, and because you have gone into it in such detail and you've interviewed so many different people, whether you work very closely with your photographer. But Tomas Van Houtryve is clearly such a brilliant photographer anyway, but it also had to incorporate the drone photography, which, as you said, is now the big thing. There's a lovely little bit of video where he's just sort of making it work, and it's just so interesting because it gives us a view. They built Notre Dame so huge and so high, so beautifully, but most of us couldn't ever actually see some of the detail. And what he's been able to uncover is the detail of what is hundreds and hundreds of feet high. Let's just have a look at how he was doing his drone thing.
Sure.
We've got a little bit of video here. Let's have a look at it now.
Hello, National Geographic friends and colleagues. We're here inside Paris Notre Dame Cathedral, one of the most important cultural sites in France, taking photos with the drone, indoors, outdoors. Have a look. I hope you enjoy.
Encore plus haut, encore plus haut. Ouais. Et là, monte. Et là, tu montes. Ouais.
Well, there's Thomas flying his drone, and he got some incredible shots, which we are all enjoying. But there was a funny moment, I gather, he told you, where because you have to have so many licenses to fly a drone, even your National Geographic, and even you're there in front of Notre Dame. But apparently some police stopped him, or some security people stopped him and said, you need to show us your papers. And he said, no, hang on, I need to get this moment. I need to get this particular moment. Tell me the story.
Oh, I'm not sure I remember the details, but I think it involved a rainbow, and thus an intrinsically ephemeral moment that a photographer is keen to capture. And I think it was a rainbow right behind the crane or something. The lighting was perfect, and he had already been through all the procedures and had all the permits, but that didn't stop him from being, tapped on the shoulder by a random passing Paris cop at just the wrong moment, and who detained him just long enough to miss the rainbow.
He missed the rainbow.
He did, yes. He didn't get the shot, or we would probably have it, yeah.
I mean, that really is
a photographer's nightmare.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? But I mean, all of the shots he's got are amazing, incredible, and you can only hope that. I mean, we at the moment a lot of his shots are from the top, and you see where the spire collapsed, and you wonder what's going to happen next. But you can only. How are they going to rebuild that spire?
How are they going to rebuild the spire? Well, the spire, as you say, it collapsed. It fell. The top part of it fell over as it was consumed by flames, and that part punched a hole in the nave about a few tens of feet down from the crossing. But the lower part just collapsed in on itself, and it stood right at the very center of the cross of the church, directly above the main altar. And the entire weight of that, hundreds of tons of oak and lead came down like a battering ram, punched that hole you see would have been a dome of limestone vaulting, and the spire just punched a hole right through it and crushed the altar underneath it. Fortunately, it was an altar that was relatively recent. It was not a 13th century relic, but still, it was a great loss. And they are going to rebuild the spire through that hole, which is how in the 19th century, when Viollet-le-Duc built the spire that burned, he actually knocked a hole in the vaults in order to set up his scaffolding and build the spire through that. Well, the hole is already there now, and Villeneuve is going to set up a scaffolding right at the crossing of the church and build build the spire, and it piece by piece, like a Lego. It's a very intricate framework, and I was told you can't pre-assemble the wood framework of the spire. You have to lift one piece at a time, and you have to, because there's so many interlocking, they're crisscrossing beams. It's a very strong wooden structure, but you have to lift the pieces up one at a time in a certain sequence in order to build it, and that's what they're going to do. But Viollet-le-Duc did the whole thing in about a year and a half, I think, in the 19th century. So once they get started on it here, there's some hope that they might, their deadline is the Summer Olympics in 2024, or at least the end of 2024. That's the deadline that Macron set. And so there's some hope that they might be able to do it.
Oh, it'd be wonderful if that could be the centerpiece of that sort of celebration. Meanwhile, you're a wonderful photographer. Actually, you were saying he had this old camera, and he decided to, obviously he's very artistic and wanted to do the artisty thing, and he took some of the photographs of the grotesques.
Yes.
Which are littered all around the top of Notre Dame. He took some sort of portraits of them with the old camera.
Yes. These were, so the grotesques, as I mentioned, were designed and built by Viollet-le-Duc, or he had them sculpted. They were additions to the church. Viollet-le-Duc, he's quite different from historical restorers today. He just had no qualms about improving on the building. He thought his idea was that he was entering into the spirit of Gothic architecture, and he might be building a Gothic church that had never been, but that would be better than the previous one. He was becoming a Gothic architect himself. That was his spirit at the time. And so those things are creations of Viollet-le-Duc. And Thomas wanted to take pictures of them, I think, with a camera that was from the same period, because, it's an interesting coincidence that, or maybe it's not a coincidence, but it exceeds my understanding as an amateur historian. But photography, which is, the art of capturing the present, was invented at the same period and at the same place as this discipline of historic restoration. It was invented in France in like the second quarter of the 19th century. Louis Daguerre, the famous inventor, or he's not the very first photographer, and there was an Englishman, of course, Fox Talbot, who was involved as well, a parallel track. But photography was being invented in the 1830s, basically, and it was, technology was changing rapidly. Daguerreotypes were obsolete within a couple of decades. And so by the time the spire was built, by the time these grotesques were built, they'd moved on to this wet collodion process. And that's the process that Thomas used to take pictures of the grotesques and also of some of the people who are working on Notre Dame now.
They're fantastic, aren't they?
It's a way of capturing sort of the link to the present, because what these people are doing now is in a way restoring the 19th century. They're restoring the 19th century restoration of the Middle Ages. But so it's a way of photographically making the connection with the 19th century. I think that was Thomas's idea.
Is the French government or the French church thinking about a new way to sort of market Notre Dame now? Because I gather a lot of people are saying it's not a museum, it's a living, breathing place, and it has to be again. But also, before the fire, about 3,000 people came to Mass on Sundays, but 12 million tourists visit every year. So how do you market it? As a tourist place, or as a place of worship, or what?
Yes, I don't know that the people who direct the church would use the word market, but they, and the thing to know about the church is that the building belongs to the French state. Since the revolution, this has been the case. But the church, the sort of tenant is the church, the Catholic Church, and they have certain rights as a tenant, and they have rights over the interior. The decisions about how to restore the spire and the outside of the church, or all the other things that pertain to that qualify Notre Dame to be an historic monument are not the authority of the Catholic Church. They're under the authority of the French state. But the Church has authority over the interior furnishings and the layout of the chapels and so on. And so, yes, as you say, they're very concerned that they have this problem. They can't. Notre Dame is too popular for its own good in a way, but they can't really, or at least there is no serious thought that I heard of stopping that. And so, and in a way, it would go counter to the Catholic religion, because after all, Christians want to convert other people to Christianity, and they see that as their duty. They want everyone that was so what the Archbishop and the people in charge of the church want to do now is find a way to sort of recuperate more of those souls visiting the church for the church. They want to convert the touristic experience into a spiritual one and see if they can attract people that way. And so they are planning a new arrangement of the chapels. I haven't seen it, but it sounds intensely pedagogic. Frankly, I'm kind of skeptical that that's going to convert a lot of people because, but on the other hand, I do believe that the beauty of such a place does have a spiritual impact on people. Not the captions you read on the meanings of or the story of the Bible, but just the incredible beauty of the place that was made by people who believed devoutly.
Yeah, for 900 years, and gave their artistry and all of their absolutely astonishingly, but it has to still belong in the 21st century and beyond. We've got lots of questions coming in. Can I ask you a silly one? Or it's not a silly one, actually. It's really lovely because you know Paris. And Justin from New York State says, I'm 70 and I have a new partner. And I was planning to propose in Paris last year, and I still want to because Paris is the most romantic place on earth. If I come next year, where should I plan to propose? I'm using a different name. Oh, he just says, I'm using a different name in case my lovely partner is watching too. She's away at the moment, but we're both avid viewers. Right. Okay. So you know Paris very well. If he's coming in the next year, where should he propose? Where is the most romantic place in Paris?
Oh, that is an unanswerable question. That depends on your own experience of it, but there are any number of romantic places. I still think one of the bridges that connect the left bank to the Ile Saint-Louis, looking at Notre Dame, even now, though you're looking at scaffolding, though you're looking at a church without a spire, I think there's nothing like it in the world. So I might pick a spot like that.
Yeah, I quite agree. That wonderful picture that we showed earlier that was taken by your photographer, Tomas Van Houtryve, with the glittering lights. Even though, as you said, there's a lot of scaffolding there, but isn't that a sort of symbol of something? It's a symbol of rebirth, and it looks so wonderful. There we are. We're looking at it now. I can't think of a much more romantic place. Thank you so much for joining me. And it's been absolutely brilliant. And anyone watching right now can look at the February issue of Nat Geo magazine and read more, and the pictures are incredible. And the stories of all the people that Robert has interviewed are incredible. They've all got the most incredible stories. So thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been brilliant to talk to you. Thank you very, very much.
Bye.
Well, that was wonderful. Absolutely brilliant talking to him. And if you can go to Paris soon, you'll know what you're looking at. And we all want to see Notre Dame restored, don't we? Next week, by the way, on Viking.TV, it's Country Houses Week. And we'll be talking to Judy Corbett and Peter Welford, who, if you remember, I interviewed them a few weeks ago. They fell in love, when they went to Wales, they fell in love with this absolutely dilapidated and ruined castle. And Nobody in their right mind would take that on, but they did. And they took over this amazing castle and they turned it back into, well, they've reborn it. It's the most beautiful place. It's called Gwydir Castle. And they'll tell you all about the story of how they fell across it and fell in love with it and then restored it. It's incredible. They're the most amazing couple. Talk about a money pit. No, it's absolutely gorgeous. You'll love their story, and that is next week. So until I join you again on Viking TV, please stay safe, stay well as always, and I look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.